Every human society ever documented, no matter how isolated, developed some form of clothing or body covering. Not one single documented exception anywhere on the planet, which means somewhere in our past, something happened that convinced every single branch of our species, independently, that being naked was a problem worth solving. Here's what makes that strange. It took an incredibly long time to happen, far longer than most people would guess if you asked them cold. Humans lost most of their body hair somewhere around 2 million years ago. As part of an adaptation for endurance, a hairless, heavily sweating body is far better at shedding heat during long-distance movement across a hot landscape than a furred one. So by roughly 2 million years ago, our ancestors were already walking around bare-skinned. That's not the only theory for why the hair disappeared in the first place. Either a competing hypothesis, proposed by researchers Mark Pagel and Walter Bodmer, points to something less obvious: parasites. Dense fur is an ideal habitat for lice, fleas, and ticks, and as early humans began living in larger, closer-knit social groups, a hairier body would have meant a heavier parasite load and a higher risk of the diseases those parasites carry. Losing the fur may have reduced that burden. The two explanations aren't necessarily competing. Heat regulation and parasite reduction could easily have reinforced each other at the same time. Clothing didn't show up for a very long time after that. Because clothing itself doesn't preserve in the fossil record hide and fiber rot away, almost immediately, researchers had to find an indirect way to date its origin. The answer came from an unlikely source: lice. Body lice, the kind that live specifically in clothing rather than on skin or in hair, could only have evolved once clothing existed for them to live in. By tracking when body lice genetically split off from head lice, a 2011 University of Florida study estimated that humans started wearing clothing somewhere in the range of 83,000 to as early as 170,000 years ago, with earlier genetic work from 2003 estimating a somewhat more recent date, closer to 70,000 to 107,000 years ago. The exact number is still debated. What isn't debated is the gap. Humans spent something in the neighborhood of 1 million years, or more potentially over 90% of the time, since we lost our body hair completely naked, with no clothing at all. So the real question isn't just why did humans start wearing clothes? It's what changed. After all that time, that made covering the body suddenly necessary. The obvious answer is the one you probably already believe, the one that feels almost too obvious to question. Modesty. Somewhere deep down, nakedness feels like it should be covered shameful, private, something you instinctively don't want strangers to see. It's tempting to assume that feeling is the reason clothes were invented in the first place. Our ancestors felt exposed. And clothing solved that. Here's the problem with that theory. It gets the order backward. Anthropologists studying clothing origins have pointed to something that directly undermines the modesty explanation. And it's a genuinely compelling piece of counter-evidence. Naked hunter-gatherer societies, documented well into the modern era, including groups among Australian Aboriginal communities, functioned with no clothing and no apparent deficit of modesty, morality, or social order. If nakedness were inherently, biologically shameful, you'd expect that discomfort to show up universally, clothing or not. It doesn't. Modesty, it turns out, is something closer to a learned cultural rule than an innate instinct, and it varies enormously across different societies and different eras of the same society, which is exactly what you'd expect from something learned rather than hardwired. So if modesty didn't cause clothing, it looks like the reverse happened. Clothing came first, for other reasons. And modesty was built on top of it afterward, as a cultural rule that only made sense once covering the body was already normal. Once enough people were wearing something, going without it started to stand out, and standing out in a small interdependent group is its own kind of risk. Someone who deviates from a widespread group norm for any reason tends to draw scrutiny. And scrutiny in a tightly bonded social species is rarely comfortable. The shame didn't invent the clothes. The clothes eventually invented the shame. Which brings back the actual question, the one worth actually sitting with. If it wasn't modesty, what was it? The strongest current explanation ties clothing's origin directly to climate. Research by archaeologist Gilligan links the timing of clothing's emergence to the cycles of the last ice age periods when global temperatures dropped sharply and stayed cold for extended stretches. A hairless, heat-adapted body that worked brilliantly on the hot savanna became a serious liability once humans expanded into colder regions, or once the climate itself turned colder around them. Under that pressure, wrapping the body in hide or fur wasn't a cultural preference. It was closer to a survival requirement. But temperature regulation likely wasn't the only pressure at play. Once humans had lost the dense body hair that other primates rely on for a layer of physical protection, bare skin was left more directly exposed to two other things: ultraviolet radiation from the sun, and biting insects and parasites. A simple covering, even a partial one, would have offered real protection against both sunburn and skin damage on one hand, disease carrying insect bites on the other. None of this required any sense of shame at all. It required a body that got cold, sunburned, and bitten, and a solution sitting right there in the hide of every animal that had just been hunted for food anyway. There's a detail from the historical record that captures this perfectly. European observers documenting Tasmanian communities in the early 1800s described women wearing wallaby skin capes and noted that the garments weren't being used for warmth, modesty, or display at all. They were functioning as a way to carry things, including infants. The clothing wasn't clothing in the sense you're picturing. It was closer to tool. A practical solution to a practical problem, worn on the body simply because the body was the most convenient place to keep it. There's a second archaeological marker that helps pin down exactly when clothing shifted from pure necessity into something closer to identity. Simple bone awls pointed tools used to punch holes and thread sinew through hide show up at sites in South Africa dating back roughly 76,000 years, confirming that people were already shaping fitted garments long before recorded history. A more refined tool, the eyed needle, essentially an awl with a small threading hole added, doesn't appear until much later, roughly 40,000 years ago in Siberia, spreading to the Caucasus around 38,000 years ago, and reaching Europe by about 26,000 years ago. Making an eyed needle takes meaningfully more skill and effort than a plain awl, and awls alone were already sufficient to sew a functional garment. So archaeologists studying this shift, including Ian Gilligan, the same researcher behind the climate clothing connection, have argued that the extra investment required to build eyed needles points to a new motivation. Not just staying warm, but making clothing look a certain way. Around the same period, burial sites, including one near Moscow, roughly 30,000 years old, turn up skeletons adorned with thousands of small pierced ivory beads, almost certainly sewn directly onto now decomposed clothing as decoration. Gilligan's research places the point where clothing fully detached from climate and became a permanent social necessity at around 12,000 years ago, the same general window in which humans also invented agriculture and began living in larger, more status-conscious settlements. It's worth noting that Neanderthals were very likely working with hides long before any of this. Two bone tools used for scraping and softening skins turn up at Neanderthal sites tens of thousands of years earlier. But the current evidence suggests their approach stayed simpler, loosely wrapped, poncho-style coverings, rather than the tightly fitted, needle-sewn garments modern humans eventually developed. Two closely related species, independently reaching for the same basic idea, cover the body, and arriving at noticeably different levels of sophistication. That's a useful way to think about the earliest coverings in general. Before clothing was a statement about who you were, it was almost certainly closer to gear something worn because it solved an immediate physical problem, not because being uncovered felt wrong. Once that gear existed, though, something else started happening on top of it, and this is where the story gets more human. A covering that started as pure function inevitably became visible to other people, and anything visible, worn consistently by a social species that already paid enormous attention to status, group membership, and who belonged where, was almost guaranteed to start carrying, meaning it was never designed to carry. The material used, the way it was worn, the amount of skin it covered or revealed, all of it became information. Information about which group you belonged to. Information about your role, your achievements, your position in whatever hierarchy your particular group recognized. Clothing didn't just protect the body anymore, it started talking. That shift eventually got formalized in ways that have nothing to do with survival at all. In ancient Rome, a specific purple dye extracted from thousands of sea snails expensive enough that a single garment could cost a fortune was restricted largely to senators and emperors, precisely because its rarity made it useful as a visible marker of rank. Centuries later, across medieval and early modern Europe, entire legal codes known as sumptuary laws dictated who was legally permitted to wear which fabrics, colors, and furs based on social class, with violations sometimes punishable by fines. None of that regulates temperature. All of it regulates status. And it only makes sense as a system once the earlier, purely practical version of clothing was already universal enough that a society could build an entire hierarchy on top of who got to wear what. This is likely the actual origin point of everything clothing represents today: the fashion, the status signaling, the elaborate and sometimes contradictory rules about what's appropriate to show and what isn't. None of that was the seed. It was the outgrowth. The seed was cold skin, sunburn, and insect bites, solved with the nearest available hide, at some point in a window stretching from roughly 170,000 down to perhaps 70,000 years ago. There's a strange irony buried in all of this. The same clothing invented to solve real physical problems, cold, sun, parasites, ended up creating a brand new parasite of its own. Body lice, the exact insect used earlier to date when clothing began, don't exist anywhere in nature except inside human garments. They evolved specifically to exploit the new habitat clothing created, and in some regions of the world they've gone on to spread diseases like epidemic typhus. Humans solved one bug problem and, in the process, manufactured a new one that has been riding around in human clothing ever since. Which means the feeling you have right now, the one that makes the idea of being unexpectedly naked in public feel viscerally wrong, almost like a violation isn't some ancient survival instinct passed down from the earliest humans. It's a rule your particular culture taught you, sitting on top of a much older, much simpler behavior that had nothing to do with feelings at all. The discomfort is real, and it doesn't feel optional from the inside. But historically and cross-culturally, it clearly is. It's just newer than it feels, and far more optional across time and across cultures than it seems from the inside of any one of them. Every society independently ended up covering the body, but they didn't all agree on why, how much, or what it meant. Victorian Europe and a naked hunter-gatherer band would each have found the other's norms bizarre, even shocking, and both would have been equally confident they were simply following common sense. That inconsistency is the biggest clue that the meaning was added later, by us, on top of something that started out a lot more practical than anyone expected. So if you'd grown up in a culture with no clothing at all, from birth, with no one around you ever suggesting otherwise, do you think nakedness would still feel uncomfortable to you? Or is that discomfort something you think you'd never have learned in the first place? Let me know what you think in the comments. See you in the very next one.